Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of Leading from Alignment. We are at episode 182, and we have back with us a very special guest, Pastor Chris Brooks, the lead pastor of Woodside Bible Church here in the southeastern Michigan area. And Chris, thanks for coming back and spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to be a part of this wonderful podcast. You do a great job.
Thank you, Chris. Our co-host, Jim Wiegand, I'm sure you guys already missed not hearing his voice. He is out today, and he'll be with us in the next episode. So I'm flying solo here today with Chris. Chris, a couple of months ago, I think it might have been 3 months ago, I was in
Yeah.
your office with another leader, and we were talking about, I don't know. I can't even remember exactly everything we were talking about, but you mentioned something just off the cuff that really caught my attention. You mentioned three levels of community involvement, uh and isn't it weird sometimes where somebody just says something like as an
Yeah,
aside, it wasn't even the main
sure.
part of the conversation, but it just really stuck with you, and it really stuck with me because as I heard you unpack those three levels of community involvement, I thought, wow, how many of the pastors that we care for and help would benefit from just listening to that little blurb of that conversation. I think it would, and I thought in the moment it would be tremendously impactful. And so I wanted to have you on the podcast to really talk with us and explore this idea of three levels of community involvement. And Chris, would you tell us what those three levels are? And then
Yeah.
let's just kind of dive into each one.
Yeah. So first I want to say that one of the things I appreciate most about you is that you're a connector, and we
Mm.
all need relationships. And as I think back to that conversation, it was all about partnershiping. How
That's
can
right.
we work together more cooperatively to be able to advance God's kingdom? And isn't it amazing what can happen when we're not worried about who gets the credit, when it really is about the kingdom as opposed to our own little chiefdoms and building our own reputations? And so I've loved being in a relationship with you for that and many other reasons. But yeah, in the midst of that conversation, we talked about community engagement, community involvement. And that's been a passion of my heart for 30 years of ministry now. And I've been able to figure out some things that have worked and some things that haven't. But when you think about community engagement, we should think about it on one of three levels. Now, let me just say, as a preface to this is not a value statement. This is not
Mm.
to say that one level is better than the other. It's just
Okay.
important to understand the difference. So the first is community service. So that's the first level. Second is community development. And then third is community empowerment. So those are the three: community service, community development, and community empowerment. I think most people will be familiar with the term community development. So often everything falls up under that umbrella, but it really is unique and distinct from the other two.
Okay. So Chris, why don't we just dive into that first level, community service? Uh, Tell us a little bit about that and how that works and what that looks like.
Yeah, community service is what many of us find ourselves doing, and that is resource distribution. It is us giving to the community resources that they lack or that they need. A lot of us are serving in under-resourced communities, or to put it in a different way, every single one of us are serving in communities that have under-resourced areas. So maybe
Yeah.
there are kids who need backpacks. Maybe there are homeless people that need homeless kids. Maybe there are families that are facing food insecurity that need food. So the distribution of resources is typically what community service looks like. And so being able to mobilize our people to say, we're going to do a backpack drive for back to school, or being able to mobilize our people and saying that we're going to distribute meals, is again what, or Christmas gifts, or Thanksgiving boxes at Thanksgiving time. All of that would fall up under community service, and it's a huge blessing for the community.
Okay. So talk to me then about community development.
Yeah, so community service, going back to that, is really good, but it does not move the needle typically for moving someone from dependency to self sufficiency. So, if the
Yeah.
goal ultimately is to get a person from depending on the government for handouts or depending on us for handouts, then we got to move beyond community service. Sadly, so often we've been content as the church to say, well, this person's not maybe, let me put it a different way. We've often been content telling a one sided story that celebrates how much stuff we gave away without evaluating whether or not that moved the needle for someone else.
Yeah.
So I've given out hundreds of backpacks. We've given out hundreds of boxes of turkey for Thanksgiving and all those things. And we celebrate those things, and that is great for us to do. But if we ask ourselves, does this person still have those needs? Probably. What I found in our ministry is that for years and years and years, the same people we helped the year previously were the same people who were coming back year over year. So what community development then says is, let's move from resource distribution to program development or even institution development. That there needs to be programs and institutions that do things like workforce preparation. How do we help people get prepared for a job? How do we help people get prepared for housing? So there can be a housing program that helps people with affordable housing, educational programs like after school programs. So the difference between community service, which is just resource distribution, and community development is that now we have programs, we have institutions, we have initiatives that are designed to fill gaps in the social welfare of the community we're trying to serve.
And Chris, as you unpack that level, I can hear or feel maybe some of our listeners and watchers thinking, "Wow, that seems like a lot. Like that seems like a big leap for us." I would say the majority of our listeners and watchers are involved in community service at some level.
Yes, which is great.
And how do you make that
Yeah,
transition into that
yeah.
level of
I
development?
love it. Yeah, I think there's two ways. Number one, survey your congregation and see who is already in your church that may be doing some of this work. So, for example,
Mm.
preparing people for housing can be as simple as saying, hey, can I get the real estate and mortgage professionals in my church to put on workshops, to commit to doing financial education, right? So, surveying there. Maybe you got some HR professionals in your church, two or three, who say, yeah, we could put on workshops for workforce development. How do you apply for a job? How do you dress for an interview? How do you, make sure you get the job? All of these things can be a part of community development. But the other way of doing community development is through partnerships.
Okay.
Most community organizations that already exist are looking for and desires of partners. And so part of what we would do is to say, what organizations could we align ourselves with? And let's partner with them. So, for example, if there's a literacy program or organization in your community that's teaching kids reading skills, maybe you say to them, hey, would you mind offering your program at our church for our community 1 to 2 nights a week, where we become a site for your literacy program? Or maybe there is again, fatherhood initiative that is happening in your community that you can bring to your site. So don't feel the pressure that you have to create every new initiative.
Yeah.
or create every new program. If you have those types of resources in your church, great. But if not, leverage partnerships that are already there in your community.
That's so good. As you were sharing that, I was thinking, let's not reinvent the wheel, right?
Yes.
And I think that's some of the pressure a leader might feel like, I've got to create this thing.
Yes.
And I love the idea of utilizing the skills that you have resident within the church, and reaching out to community organizations that are already doing some of these wonderful things and figuring out, how can we work together? How can we partner? I think that takes so much pressure off you as a
Yeah.
pastor to not
If
have
I
to
could,
think all this stuff up.
if I could recommend just two tools that are really
Sure.
helpful, there's an organization called Made to Flourish. Made to Flourish, and they have a tool. It's about a $500 assessment, if you will, but they will help you to do a survey of your church, no matter the size, to create a database that lets you know and track where occupationally your church is.
Okay.
So it'll list for you, here are all the teachers in your church. Here are all the engineers in your church. Here are all the doctors, or whatever the case may be, by name. And that really helps with outreach, because some outreaches you may say, man, I need, some folks who can do carpentry work, right? We're going to do some carpentry work. It's nice to be able to have that database to go in and say, here are all the people in my church that do that type of work. So I would say that that's a very important resource. And then there's also organizations that will help you to do what's known as community asset mapping. And community asset
Okay.
mapping is just a way of you being able to say what already exists in our community, so that we can know who to partner with, who's already out there.
Well, that's perfect. So can you give me those two resources again, Chris? What
Yes,
was the first
Made to
one?
Flourish. Made to
Okay.
Flourish. They can do the congregational assessment. And typically, if you go to your local chamber of commerce, they can help you with the asset mapping for who's already in your community, both for profit and nonprofit.
That's so helpful. Thank you for that. Chris, one of the thoughts that, as I've been reflecting on these three, we're going to talk about community. Well, you know what? I'm going to ask you that later. Let's talk about a
Okay.
community empowerment, because, but I do have a
Yeah.
question about the leadership piece that's required to move in
Yes.
these levels. But let's come back to community empowerment. What's that? What does that look like?
Yeah, so typically, and this is something we've seen in missions globally, typically when we come into a community as a church and we start programs and initiatives, it's our people who run those programs and initiatives, and they aren't always from the community
Right.
that we're serving. For years and years and years, I pastored a church where about 50% of our church family drove into our community from other communities. And there's nothing wrong with that. They had a great heart to serve, and that's wonderful. But the difference between community development and community empowerment is who owns the program, who leads the program.
I
And
gotcha.
ultimately, what you want to do in community empowerment is to raise up indigenous leaders that are living in that context, living in that community, that you turn ownership of the part of the program over to, where you're
Okay.
not running it as an outsider for them, but ultimately they're empowered to run it themselves and have a sense of self-determination, because nobody's going to know their community like they will.
Right.
When we look at the people who are in need as more than just mouths that consume, but minds that create,
Hmm.
it helps us to see them as a solution and not just a problem. So we're not going into communities thinking there are no assets here, there are no leaders here, God has never moved here, and we're here to fix it, or we're here to bring Jesus for the first time to the community. What we're doing is going into communities saying, God has already been at work. we get a chance to discover where he's been at work and to be a catalyst for being able to spur that work on and
Yeah.
hopefully invest in and train up leaders. Now, sometimes that means a long-term commitment. We have
Yeah.
friends like John Gunn, who
Mm.
adopted the city of Pontiac and has literally over decades raised up a pipeline of leaders from childhood all the way up to adulthood. Sometimes it takes that. Other times there are natural leaders that are there that you can say, we can support their program instead of having to create our own. Or if we've already created one, we can invite them in to lead it. So it's led by indigenous people that are already a part of the community.
That's so good. Um, Chris, I'm wondering, and this isn't one of the questions that I had sent to you ahead of time, so please forgive me in advance. Um,
Yeah,
is it always the goal to move? Because as you talk about it, I know that you're
yeah,
not marginalizing any of these three
no,
areas at all. But it almost sounds to me, and if I'm not thinking about this right, please correct me, that that there is almost a growth to this that where the logical end or the desired end, maybe is a better phrase,
yes.
is community empowerment. Am I thinking incorrectly about that? Or
No,
am I onto
I think
something there?
I think you're spot on. Wherever possible, that
Yeah,
is what you're ultimately hoping for is to not create. And this is there's so much we could talk about here, but this is one of the problems that we face in community development, both globally and domestically, is that the moving from development to empowerment is hard
mm,
because typically when you're in a development stage, you have programs and initiatives that you're fundraising for. You hire staff. And so now you feel this obligation to say, man, we got staff, we got programs here, and it almost takes on a life of itself. And you forget that the goal was ultimately the empowerment of the community. And now it becomes the maintenance of the machine. And so
yeah,
I would just simply say that going into any community, we need to be clear on what the goals are up front. Number one, the goal is to move people from dependency to self sufficiency. Number two, the goal is to move people from receiving resources to actually owning their responsibility for their own community. So ownership, right? And so if I know that the goal is to move them to ownership and self-determination, then everything in our plan is moving towards that. I'm almost working my way out of a job and
yeah.
defining success that way.
And I'm wondering if that is that kind of helps with the machine aspect that you talked about. Hey, we're setting expectations right out
Yeah,
of the gate that,
yes,
yeah, at some point in this process, we probably will have some staff and but the end goal is is empowerment. And so
yes,
we
yes.
want you to understand that going in to
Yeah,
this,
and
that,
one book that I would just recommend. There's a lot of great books on this, but certainly when helping hurts. Many have heard this book before, but it is a great book that really speaks to how to properly serve a community. When
mm,
helping hurts, Brian Fickard
okay,
is the last name of the author, and Brian's an economist who did a lot of evaluation on the way that we engage communities. And what he ultimately discovered is that most of our work is not moving people from dependency to self reliance. And so it's a different way of measuring. So it really causes us to begin to ask questions like, how many people no longer need us as
yeah.
a more determining factor of success than how many people are we servicing?
Mm,
So when helping hurts is a
so
great
good.
handbook.
I love it. When we coach pastors, Chris, it's our intention not to prescribe, because we believe. that the expertise is there, the knowledge is there,
Yeah,
and our goal as a coach is to help draw that out. And what we've noticed when we approach helping that way, the confidence level of the leaders that we are helping just grows. They realize, man, I know more than I really ever thought I knew.
that's right. That's
And
right.
and so I love that whole thought process. Um, and I would imagine in community empowerment, that same dynamic happens where people start to get this
Yeah.
confidence, like, man, I do have more inside of me than I ever realized I did.
Yeah. I mean, I got a 3-year-old daughter who happily I will help to feed her or hold her or help her to climb up into a chair. I don't do that with my teenagers. And my mom certainly doesn't do that with me. So part of what we want is as people grow, right? We want to be able to celebrate that growth by saying, I no longer need to do certain things for you because
Yeah,
you can do it yourself. Maybe early on in a relationship, it's highly appropriate to
right.
do certain things for people. And a lot of that comes back to assessment. But the longer you're involved in the community, hopefully what you're seeing is they need me less. That's a healthy thing.
Yeah. So Chris, that's just so helpful. And I feel like you've given us a like a vision for this,
Yeah.
to think about this in a much broader and complete way. I have one more question for you because we are butting up against time here. I'm wondering, Chris, what kind of leadership development within a congregation needs to happen for a church to make progress in these three areas of community involvement? Uh, is there something to be considered there?
Yeah, I think that Jesus, if we look at the model of ministry that Jesus developed, he spent 3.5 years developing a group of disciples who ultimately he was going to entrust the ministry to, and then gave them the charge to go do the same, to
Mm,
find and raise up disciples that they would pour themselves into so that they can turn ministry over to them and it would spread. And so I think in our leadership development, we need to have as a goal this whole thought of multi-generational discipleship making. And I see discipleship and leadership development as synonymous, one and the same. And I
right.
think that we should be developing this mindset, cultivating this heart that I am walking with you in hopes of being able to entrust to you leadership, and that you should be striving to do the same. Walk with
Yeah.
someone that you can entrust leadership to. And as we think about our communities, that's the goal there too.
Yeah. And as I look back on decades of ministry, that's the most satisfying ministry to me
Yes.
is when I see people that I've been working with, people that I've been helping take ownership
Yeah.
and they don't really need me anymore and they've figured it out and it's their
Yeah.
baby now.
Yes.
Um, I've gotten the most joy, I think, out of that. So, Chris, I want to just say thank you again for carving out time to be with us. I realize uh, schedule that you keep, and you're in demand, and I'm so honored that you would carve out time to be with us in episode 181 and now in episode 182. God bless you. Thank you so much for your heart and your willingness to spend some time with me. Thanks for being my friend. And, we wish you well in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah. Well, love and appreciate you. And it's an honor to be with you as well, man. Anytime.
All right. Thanks, Chris. And if you're listening or watching today and you'd like to reach out to learn more about what we've been talking about today, you can reach us at convergecoach.com and go to the contact us link. Fill out a simple form and submit it, and somebody from our team will reach out to you to have a conversation. So God bless you, our listeners and watchers. We love you. We appreciate what you do for a living. and we're rooting and cheering for you as you continue to lead from alignment.